Margaret Thompson sat quietly in the corner booth of Rose Garden Restaurant, her favorite spot for the past 20 years. At 78, she moved slowly but with dignity, her silver hair neatly pinned back and her gentle eyes focused on a small book of poems. The restaurant had become her second home since her husband passed away 5 years ago. The wooden booth felt familiar under her hands as she turned each page carefully. She had been coming to this same table every Tuesday evening for 2 decades. The owner, Mrs. Chen, always saved it for her. The red checkered tablecloth was the same one that had been there when she first discovered this place with her late husband, William. Margaret sipped her jasmine tea slowly, savoring the warmth that spread through her chest. The restaurant buzzed with the gentle sounds of families enjoying their dinners together. Children laughed at nearby tables while their parents shared stories from their day. The kitchen staff moved efficiently behind the counter, preparing fresh meals with care and pride. She had ordered her usual meal, vegetable soup and steamed dumplings. The soup reminded her of the one her mother used to make when she was a little girl growing up in London. Those were simpler times, when families gathered round dinner tables every night and treated each other with respect and kindness. Margaret glanced up from her book occasionally to watch the young waitress, Emma, working hard to serve all the customers. The girl reminded her so much of her own granddaughter who lived far away in Scotland. Emma had the same bright smile and eager-to-please attitude that Margaret remembered from her own youth when she worked in her father's shop. The warm evening atmosphere was suddenly broken when 5 loud motorcyclists burst through the front door. Their heavy boots stomped across the wooden floor, and their leather jackets creaked as they moved. The peaceful dinner conversation stopped as heads turned to look at the newcomers. Their leader, a tall man named Jack, demanded immediate service. Despite the busy dinner rush, his voice boomed across the restaurant, drowning out the soft background music. The other 4 men spread out behind him, taking up space and making their presence known to everyone. "Hey, we need a table right now," Jack shouted, his face red with impatience. He snapped his fingers at Emma, who was carrying a tray of food to another table. "You, come here." Emma quickly delivered the food to her customers and hurried over to the group. Her hands trembled slightly as she grabbed menus from the hostess stand. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Rose Garden Restaurant. If you could please wait just a moment. I'll find you a table. We don't want to wait," Jack said coldly. "We want food now." His friends nodded and made comments about how slow the service was. Emma nervously approached their table, trying her best to be helpful despite their rude behavior. Margaret watched the scene unfold with growing concern. She had seen bullies before, and she recognized the signs. These men were looking for trouble, and poor Emma was just trying to do her job. The other customers looked down at their plates, uncomfortable with the aggressive behavior but too afraid to say anything. "What do you recommend?" one of Jack's friends asked Emma, but his tone was mocking rather than genuine. "And it better be good, or we're not paying." Emma's voice shook as she described the restaurant's specialties. She recommended the beef and broccoli, the sweet and sour pork, and the fried rice. Her hands fumbled with her notepad as she tried to write down their orders while they changed their minds repeatedly. "Actually, we want something else," Jack said after Emma had written down their complete order. "Start over. And bring us water while we decide." When Emma accidentally spilled a few drops of water while serving their table, Jack stood up angrily. The chair scraped loudly against the floor as he pushed it back. His face turned dark red, and his voice rose even louder than before. "Can't you do anything right?" he yelled, pointing at the tiny puddle on the table. "This is the worst service I've ever seen. You're completely useless." His friends laughed as Emma's face turned red with embarrassment. Tears began to form in her eyes, but she tried to stay professional. "I'm so sorry." "Sir, let me clean that up right away." "Don't touch it," Jack snapped. "You've done enough damage already. Maybe you should find a job you can actually do." Margaret felt her heart break as she watched Emma's shoulders shake with silent tears. The young woman reminded her so much of herself when she was that age, working hard, trying to please everyone, and facing cruelty from people who should have known better. The restaurant had become completely silent except for Jack's angry voice. Other customers whispered to each other, but no one seemed willing to intervene. Margaret understood their fear, but she also understood that sometimes good people have to stand up to bullies. Margaret closed her book slowly. She had seen enough. Rising from her seat with her walking cane, she approached their table with quiet determination. Her heart beat faster, but her resolve was strong. Sometimes, she thought, someone needs to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Margaret said softly, her voice calm but firm. "I wonder if you might speak more kindly to this hard-working young lady." The words hung in the air like a gentle breeze that somehow commanded attention. Margaret stood beside their table, her walking cane steady in her right hand, her left hand resting peacefully at her side. She wore a simple blue dress with small white flowers, the kind of outfit that spoke of dignity and grace rather than fashion. Jack and his friends burst into laughter. The sound was harsh and cruel, echoing off the restaurant walls. "Look at this old lady trying to tell us what to do," Jack mocked, his voice dripping with disrespect. He stood up from his chair, towering over Margaret's small frame. "Why don't you go back to your soup, Grandma?" The other customers watched nervously as Jack loomed over the elderly woman. His friends continued to chuckle, thinking this was all very amusing. One of them, a man with a thick beard named Mike, shook his head and grinned. "Can you believe this? Some old woman thinks she can boss us around." Margaret remained perfectly still, her gentle eyes meeting Jack's angry ones. She had faced difficult people before in her long life, and she knew that anger often came from pain. Her voice stayed soft and measured as she spoke. "I simply believe that everyone deserves to be treated with respect," she said quietly. Emma stood frozen near the kitchen, watching the scene unfold. Her hands still trembled from the earlier confrontation. And now she worried that this kind old woman might get hurt because of her. The other restaurant staff had noticed the commotion and were gathering near the kitchen door, unsure of what to do. "Respect," Jack sneered, his face growing redder with each word. "You want respect? Let me show you what I think of your respect." His voice grew louder and more threatening. The veins in his neck stood out as his anger increased. Jack's friends encouraged him with nods and comments. "Yeah, show her who's boss." One of them said. "These old people need to learn their place," added another. They seemed to enjoy watching their leader intimidate an elderly woman. Margaret could see the pain behind Jack's anger. She had worked as a nurse for 40 years before retiring, and she had learned to read people's emotions. This man was hurting inside, and he was taking it out on innocent people. Her heart felt sad for him, even as she prepared to protect Emma and the other customers. "Please, sir," Emma whispered from across the room. "Don't hurt her. She's just trying to help." Jack turned his attention back to Margaret, his eyes filled with rage. "Nobody asked for your help, old woman, and nobody asked for your opinion either." He reached out to push Margaret's walking cane away, expecting her to stumble and fall like any other elderly person would. But something unexpected happened as Jack pushed the cane aside. Margaret remained perfectly balanced. Her feet stayed firmly planted on the floor, and her body didn't waver even slightly. The walking cane clattered to the floor, but Margaret stood as steady as a tree with deep roots. Her posture shifted slightly. And though she still looked like a gentle elderly woman, there was something different about the way she stood. Her shoulders straightened just a little, and her feet moved into a position that looked natural but somehow more stable. Her breathing remained calm and controlled. I spent 6 years learning that true strength comes from protecting others, not hurting them, Margaret said calmly. Her voice carried a quiet authority that made everyone in the restaurant look up from their meals. Even the kitchen staff stopped what they were doing to listen. Jack stared at her in confusion. He had expected her to fall, to cry, or to run away in fear. Instead, she stood before him with a peaceful confidence that he had never encountered before. Her grey eyes held no fear, no anger, only a deep wisdom that came from decades of experience. "What are you talking about?" Jack asked, his voice less certain than before. He looked down at the walking cane on the floor, then back at Margaret, trying to understand how she could stand so steadily without it. Margaret's voice remained gentle but firm. "I'm talking about choosing kindness over cruelty. Young man, I'm talking about protecting people who cannot protect themselves." She glanced toward Emma, who was watching with wide eyes. "This young woman is working hard to serve you, and she deserves your respect, not your anger." The restaurant had become completely silent. Even the soft background music seemed to have stopped. Customers at other tables turned in their chairs to watch the confrontation. Children stopped eating and stared at the unusual scene. Jack hesitated. For a moment, confused by her confidence. He was used to people being afraid of him, but this old woman showed no fear at all. Her calm presence seemed to fill the space around them, making his anger feel small and childish. His friends looked at each other uncertainly. This wasn't going the way they had expected. The old woman should have been scared, should have backed down. But instead she stood there like she knew something they didn't. Margaret waited patiently for Jack's next move, her expression kind but determined. She had made her choice to stand up for what was right, and she would see it through to the end. When Jack reached out to shove Margaret, something beautiful happened. With movements as graceful as a dancer, Margaret simply stepped to the side. Her body moved like flowing water, smooth and natural. Jack's own force sent him stumbling backward into his chair, confusion written across his face. The wooden chair scraped loudly against the floor as Jack fell back into it. His arms flailed as he tried to catch his balance, but he couldn't understand what had just happened. One moment he was pushing forward with all his strength, and the next moment he was sitting down again, feeling dizzy and bewildered. "How did you—" Jack started to say, his voice trailing off in amazement. He looked up at Margaret, who hadn't moved more than a few inches from where she had been standing. She looked exactly the same as before, a gentle elderly woman in a simple blue dress, but something about her presence had changed completely. Margaret raised her hand gently, palm facing outward in a peaceful gesture. "I learned long ago that the best way to stop aggression is not with more aggression, but with understanding," she said. Her voice was still soft and kind, but it carried a strength that filled the entire restaurant. She took a small step closer to Jack, her movements still graceful and controlled. "You seem angry about something deeper than just your dinner service," she continued, her grey eyes looking directly into his. "What's really troubling you, young man?" Jack's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He had never had anyone speak to him this way before. Most people either feared him or fought back with equal anger. But Margaret was doing something completely different. She was treating him like a human being who deserved understanding, even after he had been so cruel to her and Emma. The restaurant had fallen completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped working to watch. Plates sat half prepared on the counter as cooks and dishwashers peeked round the corner to see what was happening. The soft clinking of dishes and the gentle hum of conversation had been replaced by complete, breathless silence. Margaret stood calmly, her hands folded in front of her, waiting patiently. She didn't tap her foot or check her watch or show any signs of impatience. She simply stood there with the kind of peaceful presence that made everyone round her feel calmer, even in the middle of such a tense situation. Jack's friend Mike looked at his leader with growing concern. Jack was supposed to be the tough one, the one who could handle any situation. But now he was sitting in his chair looking lost and confused, staring at an elderly woman who seemed to possess some kind of magic power. Mike stood up next, thinking his leader needed help. He was younger than Jack, with thick muscles and tattoos covering his arms. He had been in many fights before, and he was confident that he could handle one old woman. No matter how strange she seemed, "Nobody treats my friend Jack like that," Mike said, his voice trying to sound threatening. He rolled up his sleeves and cracked his knuckles, putting on a show of strength for the other customers to see. But when Mike moved toward Margaret, she simply took a small step and guided his momentum away from her. Her hand barely touched his arm, but somehow she redirected all of his forward motion. Mike found himself gently spun round, ending up facing the wall, completely unharmed but thoroughly confused. Mike stared at the wall for a moment, trying to figure out how he had gotten there. He had been walking toward the old woman, and now he was looking at a picture of a Chinese landscape hanging on the restaurant wall. His brain couldn't process what had just happened to him. "What just happened?" Mike asked, turning round slowly. He looked at Margaret with a mixture of fear and respect. "How did you do that?" Margaret's expression remained kind and patient. She looked at Mike the same way she had looked at Jack, not with anger or judgment, but with genuine concern for his well-being. "I studied martial arts for most of my life," she explained to the amazed crowd. The other customers leaned forward in their seats, hanging on every word. Children stopped eating their dinner and stared with wide eyes. Even the restaurant owner, Mrs. Chen, came out from behind the counter to watch, her own eyes filled with surprise and admiration. "I started learning when I was 18 years old," Margaret continued, her voice carrying clearly through the silent restaurant. "My teacher was a wise man who taught me that martial arts is not about fighting or showing off. It's about discipline, respect, and protecting those who need protection." She glanced toward Emma, who was still standing near the kitchen with tears in her eyes. "But the greatest lesson I learned was that fighting should only be used to protect those who cannot protect themselves." Emma, the young waitress, watched in wonder as this elderly woman she had served tea to countless times revealed a side of herself no one had ever imagined. Margaret had always been polite and quiet, leaving small tips and saying thank you for everything. Emma had never suspected that this gentle grandmother figure was capable of such incredible things. The other three bikers sat frozen at their table, unsure of what to do next. They had come into the restaurant expecting to intimidate everyone, but now they were the ones feeling intimidated by a 78-year-old woman who moved like poetry in motion, one by one. Jack's friends tried to help him, but each time Margaret responded with gentle, precise movements that left them sitting back down, unharmed but completely amazed. She never struck anyone or caused any real pain. Instead, she used their own energy against them, like water flowing round rocks. The third biker, a stocky man named Tom, decided to rush at Margaret from behind while she was talking to Mike. He thought he could catch her off guard and end this embarrassing situation for his group. But Margaret seemed to have eyes in the back of her head. Without even turning round, she stepped slightly to her left and extended her arm in a small circle. Tom's charging momentum carried him right past Margaret and into an empty chair at a nearby table, each. He landed gently but firmly, his own speed, having been redirected so smoothly that he barely felt Margaret's touch. He sat there blinking, trying to understand how he had ended up sitting down when he had been running forward just seconds before. "Ian, I don't understand," Tom said, shaking his head. "I was running right at you. How did I end up over here?" Margaret turned to face him with the same calm smile she had shown the others. "When you push against water, it doesn't push back," she explained patiently. "It simply moves out of the way and lets your own force carry you where it will." The fourth biker, a thin man named Dave, decided to try a different approach. He attempted to grab Margaret's arm while she was distracted with Tom, but the moment his fingers touched her sleeve, Margaret's arm seemed to disappear from his grasp. She had moved it in such a small, precise way that Dave found himself grasping nothing but air before Dave could react. Margaret had guided his reaching motion into a gentle turn that left him facing away from her hand. Looking confused, she had barely moved, but somehow Dave was now staring at the restaurant's front door instead of at her. "This is impossible," Dave muttered, turning back round. "Nobody moves that fast." "I'm not moving fast," Margaret said with a gentle laugh. "I'm simply not fighting against your movements. When you stop fighting the river, you can learn to flow with it instead." The fifth biker, a young man named Steve who couldn't have been more than 25, watched his friend's failed attempts with growing amazement. He had always looked up to Jack and the others as tough guys who could handle any situation, but now they all looked like children who had forgotten how to walk properly. Steve stood up slowly, his hands raised in a peaceful gesture. "I don't want to fight you," he said quietly. "I just want to understand what's happening here." Margaret nodded approvingly. "That's the wisest thing anyone has said all evening," she replied. "Understanding is always better than fighting." Jack looked round at his friends, all of whom were sitting in various chairs looking dazed and confused. None of them had been hurt, but all of them had been completely outmaneuvered by a woman who was old enough to be their grandmother. "Why are you doing this?" Jack asked, breathing heavily and beginning to realize he was completely outmatched. His voice had lost its earlier aggression and now sounded more like a confused child than a threatening adult. Margaret walked slowly back to Jack's table and sat down across from him. Her movements were unhurried and graceful, like someone who had all the time in the world. Her eyes were full of kindness rather than anger, and her expression showed genuine concern for his well-being. "Because I see pain in your eyes," she said softly, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who had spent decades caring for others. "I recognize it because I felt it too when I lost my husband. Sometimes we lash out at others when we're really hurting inside." Jack's tough expression began to crack. For the first time all evening, his angry mask slipped away, revealing a young man who looked lost and scared. "You don't know anything about me," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. The words came out more like a plea than a threat. Margaret reached across the table and gently placed her weathered hand over his rough one. "I know that hurting others never makes our own pain go away," she replied. "I know that these young people working here are just trying to make an honest living. And I know that somewhere inside you is a person who was raised to be better than this." Her words seemed to hit Jack like a physical blow. His shoulders sagged, and his eyes filled with tears that he tried desperately to hold back. The restaurant remained quiet. Everyone listening to Margaret's gentle words, even the children at other tables, sensed the importance of this moment and stayed silent. Emma stood nearby, no longer afraid, but filled with admiration for this remarkable woman. She had never seen anyone handle a dangerous situation with such grace and wisdom. Margaret wasn't just protecting her from the bikers. She was somehow helping the bikers protect themselves from their own anger. Jack's voice became very quiet, almost a whisper. "My mother used to say that same thing," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "She always said I was better than this." A single tear rolled down his cheek as he remembered the woman who had raised him with love and tried to teach him right from wrong. Jack looked round the restaurant at all the people he had frightened and intimidated. The weight of his actions seemed to settle on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. He saw the fear in the eyes of families who had just wanted to enjoy a quiet dinner together. He noticed how children were clinging to their parents, and how elderly couples were whispering nervously to each other. The silence in the restaurant felt different now. It wasn't the frightened silence from before, but rather a quiet waiting, as if everyone was holding their breath to see what would happen next. Jack could feel dozens of eyes watching him, and for the first time in years, he felt truly ashamed of his behavior. Slowly, he stood up from his chair and walked over to Emma. His heavy boots made soft sounds on the wooden floor as he approached her. Emma stood very still, and sure of what to expect, but she no longer looked terrified. Margaret's presence seemed to have created a safe space where real healing could begin. "I'm sorry," Jack said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had no right to treat you that way. You were just doing your job, and you were doing it well." He looked down at his hands, which suddenly seemed too big and clumsy. "I was angry about things that had nothing to do with you, and I took it out on you. That was wrong." Emma nodded, accepting his apology with grace. Her eyes were still wet with tears, but now they were tears of relief rather than fear. "Thank you for saying that," she replied softly. "It takes courage to admit when we've made mistakes." Jack then turned to face the other customers in the restaurant. Some of them were still watching him closely, while others had turned back to their meals but were clearly listening to every word. He cleared his throat and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm sorry to all of you too," he said, his voice growing stronger but remaining humble. "We came in here and ruined your peaceful dinner. You all just wanted to enjoy a nice meal with your families, and we made that impossible. I'm truly sorry for that." An elderly man at a nearby table nodded. In acknowledgement, a mother with 2 young children gave him a small smile. The restaurant owner, Mrs. Chen, watched from behind the counter with a mixture of surprise and approval. Jack's friends had been watching this transformation with amazement. They had never seen their tough leader apologize to anyone before. Mike, Tom, Dave, and Steve all stood up and joined Jack in facing the other customers. "We're sorry too," Mike said, his voice sincere. "We followed Jack's lead, but that doesn't make it right. We should have known better." Jack and his friends reached into their wallets and paid for their meal. Even though they had barely touched their food, Jack counted out enough money to cover their bill and then added much more on top of it. He walked over to Emma and placed the generous tip in her hands. "This is for you," he said. "It won't make up for how we treated you, but I hope it helps a little." The tip was more money than Emma usually made in an entire week of work. Emma's eyes widened in surprise. "You don't have to do this," she said. "Yes, I do," Jack replied firmly. "It's the least I can do." As they prepared to leave, Jack approached Margaret one final time. She had been watching the entire exchange with the same calm, kind expression she had worn throughout the evening. Her presence seemed to radiate peace and wisdom. "Thank you," Jack said, his voice humble and filled with genuine gratitude. "I don't know why you helped me, but you did. You could have hurt us badly. I can see now that you had the skill to do it. But instead, you helped us see who we really are." Margaret smiled warmly. The kind of smile that grandmothers give to grandchildren they love deeply. "Everyone deserves a second chance to be their best self," she said. "Your mother would be proud of the man you can choose to be." Jack's eyes filled with tears again at the mention of his mother. "She died 2 years ago," he said quietly. "I've been angry ever since, but she wouldn't want me to be like this. She raised me better than this. Then honor her memory by being the man she knew you could be." Margaret replied gently, "It's never too late to change." Jack nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I will," he promised. "I really will." After the bikers left, the restaurant slowly began to return to normal. Conversations resumed. Children started eating again. And the kitchen staff went back to preparing meals. But the atmosphere felt different. Now, warmer and more connected somehow. Margaret returned to her corner booth and picked up her book of poems. She continued reading as if nothing had happened. But everyone in the restaurant looked at her with new respect and admiration. She had shown them all what true strength looked like. Emma brought her a fresh cup of tea, her hands no longer shaking. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," she said. "You saved us all tonight." Margaret patted Emma's hand gently, her touch as warm and comforting as a mother's. "No, dear, we saved each other. That's what people do when they remember that we're all connected." "Indeed,"